I got drawn in or sort of into the subject about what happens after the fire, and I just want to share some experience with you.
I learn so much by talking to other people that I meet, and I make really long-standing connections.
Pouring water onto an EV in thermal runaway is like pouring water onto the roof of your house when your kitchen's on fire. Thank you, gentlemen.
Hello. I'm Kate Lamble, they've just said. When the Grenfell Tower Inquiry started back in 2018, the BBC asked if anyone would be interested in covering it, and I immediately volunteered, partly because at the time I didn't really know how long public inquiries can last, but mainly because I believed, as I still do, that the story of Grenfell, how a fire in 2017 killed 72 people in one of the richest parts of the country, goes far beyond the story of one building or one community. It shows us how our country, our construction industry, our fire services work and where they don't. So over the next 6 years, I covered every session the inquiry sat, from the personal testimony which made up phase 1 and what happened on the night of the fire, to the technical, the legal detail of phase 2 and why those combustible materials were fitted across the outside of this concrete 24-storey block. So today I want to tell you a little bit about what the inquiry heard and what it concluded. But as someone who came to this as an outsider, who learned all about approved documents and BS 8414 tests from the inquiry, I want to pull out some themes I learned along the way. The first one is pretty simple. You probably know it already. It's that detail matters. Tiny changes, tiny decisions made in your work have significant consequences for residents. Let me give you an example. One Friday night, Ed Daffan came home to his flat on the 16th floor of Grenfell Tower, and he found that the door to another flat on his floor was open. The flat was empty at the time, it was between residents, and he tried to close the door, but it wouldn't budge, it was stuck. In fact, the automatic door closing mechanism had broken. So he complained, the maintenance department came out, and they fixed it. They fixed it by removing that broken door closer, but they didn't fit another. So months later, on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire, Ed was woken up by his neighbour's smoke alarm. He opened up his front door to be met by a wall of thick, black, acrid smoke. He still tried to make his way out of the building. He grabbed a wet towel to cover his mouth. He headed for the staircase. But he found himself lost in that smoke. He's described it to me as that he started panicking. He started pouring at a wall, thinking he'd be able to take 2 more breaths. Now, this was just 20 minutes after the fire broke out of a window on the 4th floor, entering the combustible cladding and insulation on the outside walls, and had started to climb the building rapidly in a straight line, breaking into flats as it did. Now, one of those flats was the formerly empty flat on the 16th floor, the one with the broken door closer. The new resident ran out, and as he did, the door didn't close behind him, allowing that thick, black, acrid smoke to spread into the communal hallway, the hallway Ed became lost in. Now, Ed was rescued because at that moment he became lost. Firefighters reached his floor. They were searching for one of his neighbours. But that neighbour, 69-year-old Joseph Daniels, the man who the firefighters were intending to reach, he died in his flat. So with that in mind, with that knowledge that detail matters, I want to take you through some of the details of what the inquiry heard and what it sound. I want to start, hopefully this works. I want to start with the thing which underlies every decision about what was installed on the outside of high-rise residential buildings, the regulations set by government. The Phase 2 report concluded that the fire at Grenfell Tower was the culmination of decades of failure by central government and others to look carefully into the danger of incorporating combustible materials into the external walls of high-rise residential buildings and to act on the information available to them. Now, those opportunities began in 1991 with the Knowsley Heights fire. There we go. These are just a couple of examples of the chances successive governments had to learn about the risks of combustible cladding and insulation. from the Select Committee's report, which suggested that all cladding on high-rise buildings should either be non-combustible or subject to large-scale fire tests, through to 2016, when members of the industry were directly speaking to civil servants about the fact that the type of cladding involved in fires around the world, which at the time was being installed on Grenfell Tower, were regularly being installed on buildings in England and Wales. Now, of course, there are lots of examples not mentioned here. Pete mentioned the 2005 Edge fire, there's the 2001 fire test, the 2015 fire, there's the CWCT meetings that they had. So with all of this tiny timeline extended over decades, why didn't the government act? Now, watching the inquiry, it strikes me that safety was regarded as at best not a vote winner, at worst an obstruction to the economy. Government departments are driven by ministers' priorities, that manifesto promise, that new idea to win over voters, whereas something like safety, something pretty constant, something to watch, not something to build from scratch and boast about, that tends to take a back seat. It was only in the days after Grenfell that the lead civil servant in the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government told the inquiry that she met the person responsible for the fire safety section of the building regulation guidance for the first time ever. And between 2010 and 2016, the government did have a particular priority. It spoke of slashing red tape, of health and safety gone mad. Ministers denied that fire safety was included in this drive, but the inquiry still found that the government's deregulatory agenda dominated the department's thinking to such an extent that even matters affecting fire safety were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. Now, beyond their particular priorities, governments also respond to something else. They respond to immediate pressure. And there were a series of UK fires, you can see some on the timeline, but at the same time, ministers told the inquiry they felt reassured because statistics showed that deaths from fires were falling. There was no urgent problem to be tackled. Even after the Garnet Court fire in 1999, the then local MP, Brian Donohoe, says he pushed for all combustible cladding to be banned and removed. His Labour colleagues, then in government, didn't agree. One Secretary of State, he says, told him it would cost millions. Now, balancing cost and risk is something all governments have to do. But if it doesn't feel urgent, politicians can feel the situation can stand as it is. As one civil servant allegedly suggested to the all-party parliamentary group on fire safety and rescue, which titles Pete's book, Show Me the Bodies. As the years went on, snap elections, referendums, Brexit, these were all immediate problems to tackle, things which took up the government time. The inquiry also found there's the lessons. The inquiry also found the government department displayed a complacent and at times defensive attitude to matters affecting fire safety, repeatedly knocking back questions and requests for change. Now, this might all seem rather depressing, intangible, inchangeable, but for me, there's another way to look at this. There were opportunities to learn and change, a litany of opportunities, and they didn't all come from disasters. Some came from expert groups inviting civil servants along and writing to them afterwards to ask what was allowed and what wasn't. Some from dedicated campaigners, and some even came from conferences where people like Nick Jenkins asked a question, and when he didn't get a clear answer, he pursued it, time and again, right up to those who set the rules. In the case of Grenfell, those questions ultimately didn't stop the disaster. But the inquiry, each opportunity missed, had that email been answered, had someone stayed till the end of a meeting or referred the issue up to someone else, that is an investigation of a chance, however small, that could have happened, that the regulations could have changed. I've said governments respond to pressure. In the story of Grenfell, there are examples of companies lobbying for the widest use of their combustible product, but you can also see the power that industry has to highlight the problems which you have spotted first. Next, then, let's turn to the manufacturers, those which sold the products which would ultimately be fitted to the tower. The inquiry concluded that one very significant reason why Grenfell came to be clad in combustible materials was the systematic dishonesty on the part of those who made and sold the rain screen cladding panels and insulation products. They engaged, it said, in deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing process, misrepresent test data, and mislead the market. I've got to say, when I reported from the inquiry, it was the evidence of former staff from the manufacturers which most made my jaw drop. Some directly involved in testing these products admitted taking part in a deliberate and calculated deceit, acting unethically, even lying for commercial gain. Those who were most upfront in their evidence were young, often in their first roles outside of university, and had been tasked with getting their company's combustible insulation products approved for use on high-rise residential buildings. The commercial opportunity here for companies was clear. Regulations had recently allowed combustible insulation to be used on high-rise residential buildings if part of a cladding system which passed a large-scale fire test. That was a whole new market to operate in, and often reaching this market was a target set for an individual, part of their personal assessment, their key performance indicators. But look at what happened in the case of Celotex, the manufacturer whose insulation was installed across the majority of Grenfell Tower. After their first large-scale fire test failed, they held another one, adding thicker cladding panels and non-combustible magnesium oxide at important points in the facade. The use of that magnesium oxide, though, wasn't mentioned in either the test report or Celotex's wider marketing material. And listen to one junior member of the technical team, Jamie Hayes, about why he didn't raise the alarm. He said, "My understanding was that a decision had been made by the senior management. I didn't know who I should speak to, and I lacked the life experience to find the right way forward. It was a failure of courage, a failure of character, and a failure of moral fibre on my part not to do so," he told the Enquiry. Junior staff feel the pressure of a company's commercial priorities, but they need other support or targets as well, ways to raise concerns, ask questions, and feel like they will be heard. Of course, lax attitudes to fire safety went far beyond Celotex. The other insulation manufacturer, Kingspan, did carry out one successful large-scale fire test, but despite the fact that only the precise system tested should have been used, and the company had since tweaked the chemical composition of their material, K15 was still advertised as therefore being suitable for use on high-rise buildings. When one customer asked for evidence that the company's insulation was suitable for a wide range of these buildings, Kingspan's technical manager forwarded that email to his friends, saying the customer was getting him confused for someone who gives a damn. One technical team members were also recorded discussing the product being advertised as achieving Class 0 when only the foil facer rather than the complete insulation product had been tested. Doesn't actually get Class 0 when we test the whole product, though. Lol, one said. Yeah, all lies, mate. All we do is lie in here. Now, Kingspan have said statements like these were wholly unacceptable and no way to reflect its culture. Nevertheless, it is clear that teams can become disconnected from the real-life impact of their work, focusing on day-to-day pressures, the corporate projects, the next target. And watching the Enquiry, I always thought how easy that is to do in any job. You think about the next task, the next meeting, and not that big picture. Maintaining that connection to life safety is difficult, but essential. I also need to say that the products installed at Grenfell Tower don't just reflect the manufacturers which made them. They also teach us about a reliance on the certification system. All of the cladding and insulation products installed on Grenfell came with certificates from a number of companies which stated their fire safety performance. Yet many of these contained misleading or inaccurate statements. Take the main cause of the spread of the fire at Grenfell, the cladding. Rainabond 55PE, manufactured by a company called Arconic, made by thin sheets of aluminium either side of a core of combustible polyethylene. It came with a certificate which said the panels met the standards suggested by government guidance. But while Arconic sold their cladding in huge sheets, they gave instructions on how to cut and fit it in two ways. The first, flat panels, did achieve Class B, the European fire standards in the approved documents. But the other option, where the material had been bent and folded into cassettes, hadn't. In fire tests, these performed spectacularly worse, failing completely, and it was the bent cassettes fitted to Grenfell. Arconic received their certificate by only providing the results of the successful test on the flat panels, not the failed test on the cassettes. At the public inquiry, the managing director of the company's French office accepted this could be seen as a misleading half-truth. but he denied information was deliberately withheld. Even after the inquiry's findings, Arconic today maintain that they did not conceal information from or mislead any certification body, customer, or the public. But let's leave Arconic to one side for a second and look at those who issued the certificates for these products. The inquiry found the British Board of Agreement and Local Authority Building Control failed to ensure that the statements in their product certificates were accurate based on test evidence. UCAS, who oversaw these certification bodies, failed to apply proper standards of monitoring and supervision. The implication here that the current system of certification is not a solid foundation on which to build an industry is an important one. It's why one of the key recommendations from the inquiry is that a construction regulator should be responsible for assessing construction products and issuing certificates. There are further suggestions manufacturers should be required to disclose the full testing history of their products. But even if that recommendation is followed, it's striking, listening to the evidence, just how much weight those involved in the refurbishment of Grenfell, who chose these materials, relied on these pieces of paper. How many, when questioned, didn't read beyond the first few lines, didn't inspect the details, maybe weren't even aware of the standards required? Responsibility can never be outsourced entirely. With products like these installed on hundreds of buildings then across the country, we've got to turn next to the contractors, those who designed and worked on the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. The inquiry found that the choice of combustible materials resulted from a series of errors caused by the incompetence of the organisations and individuals involved in the refurbishment. It specifically mentioned the architects, the main contractor, and the specialist cladding contractor, finding they failed to identify their own responsibilities for each aspect of the design, and in each case assumed that someone else was responsible for fire safety. The refurbishment of Grenfell begins in 2011, when a new school and leisure centre covered in cladding was being built opposite. Staff at the local council discussed whether Grenfell's concrete walls should also be covered up. And this email show, they thought, could help prevent one of their worst property assets looking like a poor cousin to that new facility. Cladding wasn't the only thing to be added. There were new boilers, the lower floors rearranged to fit extra flats. And the work to design this was given to the same architects who'd worked on the school and leisure centre opposite, a company called Studio E. Studio E, though, had never overclad a high-rise residential building before. In fact, staff admitted to the inquiry that if there had been a competition to decide who would get the work, they wouldn't have won. They simply didn't have enough relevant experience. Of course, a lack of experience doesn't mean you're destined to do a bad job, but new challenges require research. The lead architect, Studio E, put on the Grenfell refurbishment, though, told the public inquiry he didn't familiarise himself with the building regulations on fire safety. And when fire safety standards were put to him at the inquiry, he didn't recognise most of them. When selecting materials, Studio E included several suggested by other companies without checking whether they met government guidance. What they did do is ask fire safety consultants to review the project. Exova wrote 3 draft fire safety strategies. All 3 stated the refurbishment would have no adverse effect on external fire spread. None mentioned Grenfell would be clad at all. Exova staff told the inquiry they thought the architects would ask them to look at cladding if necessary. Here then, we have a company without expertise relying on a company without full knowledge of the project. And those lines of responsibility would become even more tangled when a design and build contractor, Ryden, took over and hired a web of subcontractors, who often hired their own. In all, there were more than 17 companies involved in the Grenfell refurbishment. At the public inquiry, almost all argued that they didn't hold responsibility for checking the work for fire safety. Instead, pointing to another they presumed was checking. I'll give you an example. The specialist cladding company, Harley Facades, passed drawings to the architects. They presumed the architects would check them for compliance. The architects presumed the specialist contractor was doing that. They were just going to check them for architectural intent, how they looked. With responsibility unclear, neither actually carried out the checks. Beyond the lack of knowledge and unclear responsibility here, there has always seemed to me to be something else at play, an inherent lack of curiosity. It's not just the assumption that someone else would probably check, it's the lack of interest in who would be doing that, in how one piece of work would link with another. And that's something Dame Judith Hackett has told me she also came across in her wider review. There's this moment at Grenfell that I often think about. As the combustible cladding and insulation were fitted to the outside of the building, another team inside were fitting insulation underneath and around the new windows. And during that process, they switched the material from non-combustible mineral wool to the same form of combustible insulation being fitted outside. And to my imagination, that suggests two teams who could potentially see each other through the window were fitting combustible products either side of a millimetre-thick rubber membrane, creating together a clear route for flames to move from the inside to the outside of the building, neither asking the other what they were doing, none considering the implications of how their work would work together. And there's a phrase which comes up time and again at Grenfell, whether it's through the evidence of civil servants or conversations I've had over the years with firefighters, that they didn't think something that bad could happen here. Maybe that created an environment of complacency. To tackle that, I'd suggest that curiosity, that question, who's doing this, what's going in there, that has the potential to change a lot. When work was finished, signed off by a building control department which didn't properly scrutinise the design or choice of materials, the tower was transformed. Its concrete shell hidden behind layers of combustible insulation and cladding. Residents had no idea of the dangers, but they did spot practical errors, gaps between windows that they could put their hand through and feel the air. And of course, on the night of the fire, these gaps were filled with smoke. With the refurbishment complete, there's one layer left to check and protect Grenfell from a fire on this scale. Work from the building's owner and managers to assess the risk posed by the block. However, the inquiry finds that the years between 2009 and 2017 were marked by a persistent indifference to fire safety, particularly the safety of vulnerable people. The reasons why are in some way similar to that of the government, where we began. Fire safety wasn't a priority for the relationship between the local council, which owned the building, and the tenant management organisation, which ran it. There were no key performance indicators for fire safety, and the inquiry finds that without rigorous scrutiny, the management of fire safety was weak. There was no complete fire safety strategy in place, an ill-qualified fire risk assessor was uncritically relied upon, and there was no adequate system to ensure defects were correctly remedied. But beyond the work not being completed, teams were also not connected. Despite an enforcement notice from the fire brigade about a lack of door closing mechanisms from some flat front doors, not only was an inspection and maintenance programme not introduced, it doesn't appear as though maintenance staff were informed about the importance of these devices. Remember that story I said about Ed Defan, of maintenance staff removing that device from his neighbour's door? And relationships with the residents, the inquiry found, were increasingly characterised by distrust, dislike, personal antagonism and anger. It notes the toxic atmosphere was fuelled by mistrust on both sides. But for the TMO to have allowed the relationship to deteriorate to such an extent reflects a serious failure on its part to observe its basic responsibilities. And here, I want to take you back to the 72 people who died as a result of the fire at Grenfell Tower. The survivors, too, we should remember, have been permanently changed by their experiences. Some have told me they'll never be able to return to the person they were before that night. And I wanted to bring you back here because everything I have spoken about today, the regulations, the improved documents, all of fire safety, isn't actually about compliance with rules, whether by letter or by spirit, but it's about the safety and the protection of people. Residents should be at the heart of every decision connected to tall buildings. And yet, in the refurbishment of Grenfell, while cost, colour, material, insulation properties and many more things were discussed, the safety of people is what we saw discussed the least. And today, above all, I would challenge you to change that. Thank you.